Sterling is a writer and has lectured and talked about the implications of virtual reality, of information superhighways and so on. He goes, I believe, into corporate headquarters and frightens all the executives with talks about hackers and such like. He's also author of Hacker Crackdown, which has just been published, which gives some idea of the implications, the politics of all this, which I hope is going to share with us today. So, Bruce Sterling, thank you. 20 minutes? 20 minutes? Yeah.
Great. Hi. Thanks for having me in, everybody. I'd like to begin with the miracle of the digital loaves and fishes here. I always carry these. These are Macintosh discs. They have the aerodynamics of shurikens, so please don't be blinded, or if you are, don't sue. I come from a very litigious society, the United States. You know, they have a whole wasp nest of Macs over in that other room there, so if you go out and buy some floppies and no one's looking, you can make an infinite number of copies of those. And they have far, far more information than I could possibly convey to you in 20 minutes. I mean, it's a couple of years' worth of lectures and various oddities dredged from the bits of cyberspace, including a thing in there called Future Culture, which I recommend very highly. It was put together by a little computer underground denizen kid named Andy Hawks in Colorado. Has lists of underground bulletin board systems in the United States, internet discussion groups, sort of the whole sticky mess of the underground. And if you don't believe that the computer underground exists, well, it does. You know, and I have met them, and they're out there, and there are thousands of them. And can they start World War III from a payphone? No. But can they break into computer systems? Yes. So if you go out and you become involved in this kind of alternative computer culture activity, and you begin stealing long-distance phone service and pirating software and breaking into computer systems and performing various bits of digital skullduggery, when you are arrested by the Scotland Yard Computer Crimes Unit, 4 of the hardest working guys in cyberspace, don't, when you crack under interrogation, as you certainly will, don't say it's all the fault of that Yankee cyberpunk and his floppy disks. If it weren't for him, I'd have been on the straight and narrow the whole time. If you get into trouble, ladies and gentlemen, it's your own lookout. And when I wrote my book, Hacker Crackdown, the very hot-button topic in computer civil liberties at the time was police search and seizure activities. If you've seen those Apple Macintosh ads for the Power Book, you have the crux of the problem. It's what's on your Power Book, and the person opens it up, and there they are standing proudly, and it's like everything. It's, well, my income tax returns, and the letter where I blew off my boyfriend for good, and and that scheme that she and I worked together, and the spreadsheet that I worked on, and the letter from the headhunter. And I mean, people are actually carrying unbelievable amounts of intensely personal and private material around on these machines that, you know, cost a lot of money and are very valuable and are easily stolen. And the privacy threat there is just astonishing. And there is nothing an electronic cop dotes upon so much as entering the home of a computer malefactor and confiscating every electronic item that person possesses, without exception. Sony Walkman, Sonic CDs, they'll yank the telephone right out of the wall. They will vacuum up everything that has the least possible attachment to an act of computer crime. And generally they never press charges. They just take the stuff. But that still goes on. It doesn't go on with quite the same gusto as it did in 1990, mostly because of the Steve Jackson Games case, when some Secret Service agents pulled a dawn raid on a Texan outpost of, well, they were simulation gamers actually, but kind of an early version of the Waco Branch Davidians there. Luckily, they were not heavily armed, so there was not an immediate massacre of the federal agents. But there was a lawsuit, which concluded about 4 years later with the Secret Service forced to pony up 150 grand to Mr. Jackson. So they have been sued for this practice and have lost, but of course most people who are raided by the police and lose every electronic item they possess do not sue, because A, it takes 4 years. And if you think about it, I mean, computers are such ephemeral machinery that if you lose them, in 18 months they're dog meat anyway, right? You're just going to buy the next generation in any case. So we have this peculiarly extra legal situation in the United States. Bulletin board systems are special targets because they carry out so much criminal activity. They really are the core of the electronic underground. People are there teaching one another, bootstrapping their way up to all kinds of illicit knowledge. And if you log on to one of these bulletin boards, you won't just find the usual malarkey about getting root on Unix. There are people there talking about building Molotovs, you know, how to fit a mortar in the back of a van. I mean, the whole works. It's surprising how simple a lot of this stuff is. That's still, you know, it's a question. It's going to remain a question. It's a difficulty. You know, being deprived of electronic equipment, being deprived of your electronic empowerment. There's nothing like seeing it happen or having it happen to someone you know for you to suddenly realize, wait a minute, I've got a lot invested in this machinery. It's very peculiar. But that's not really the hot button issue in civil liberties circles at the moment. At the moment, there is blood and smoke in the streets of cyberspace over the Clipper chip and the digital telephony initiative. Now, the Clipper chip, which is also known as the key escrow chip, is this device which was invented by the American National Security Agency, a group of 40,000 mathematicians outside Washington, D.C. who do not officially exist. And it is an encryption chip. It is basically, well, they wanted to put it on voice phones. It's kind of an anti-Camilla Gate thing. I mean, you're a powerful person and you're in the back of the limo and you're making really embarrassing remarks that you don't want people to tape, and they do. And they pass it to the press, and boy, are you in for it. But if you have a Clipper chip, then it's turned into this scrambled bleep of digital bits, and the usual pests out there with the monitors, and there are thousands of them, just are not able to hear it. And the NSA, whose business it is to monitor global transmissions, much as the former Soviets still do, they wanted their own chip so that they could have their own means of reading the traffic. I mean, they don't want unbreakable personal encryption. So they have come up with this Clipper device, and the algorithm, the means by which it carries out its scrambling is a state secret. So no one really knows whether they can read it at will or not. At the moment, at least last month, because we don't really get much coverage of this in the States, the NSA, as I pointed out, not existing. There were a couple of NSA guys here on a Clipper promotional tour out at GCHQ with your Cheltenham lads there who make our guys look like a bunch of amateurs, basically. And they were trying to convince the British and also the European security services that they also ought to use Clipper. Whether any European government is naive enough to use an encryption method specifically designed by America's foremost electronic espionage agency. Well, maybe, you know, I mean, stranger things have happened, you know. I've been around a while. I've seen some odd things. So the Clinton administration has come up with this scheme, and they have a very nice sort of bureaucratic thing where there's supposed to be 2 keys, and you're supposed, if you're a law enforcement officer and somebody's using Clipper scrambling, you're supposed to go get the warrant and go get the keys, and then go and unlock the discussion and read it. And it's accompanied by the FBI's sort of linked initiative, which is known as the Digital Telephony Initiative, which is basically a scheme to make the American telecommunications system wiretap friendly. The FBI is getting tired of having to actually go outside people's homes with the alligator clips and put them right on the copper wire. And as you know, people don't use the copper wire that much anymore. They're tending to go into glass fiber, which is a lot more difficult for your standard poorly trained FBI agent to tap. You know, some of these transmissions are now digital. There's packet switching. There's all this weird stuff. I mean, you could put an alligator clip on a wire now, and just a burst of Babel comes out of it. So what the FBI would prefer, in order to maintain the wiretapping capability that they now have, is for the telephone system to be designed with a sort of, you know, Walkman jack, and the central switching stations where all plain text and clear text of all telephonic and eventually computer transmissions can be monitored in real time by federal surveillance agents, which has led the computer civil liberties circles in the United States to rename the national information infrastructure the National Surveillance Infrastructure. In opposition to these two initiatives, the Clipper chip and digital telephony, there's a peculiar red-hot ragtag of civil liberties advocates, mostly the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which was started by John Perry Barlow of Grateful Dead fame, and the Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, who were also founded in California some years ago. And, you know, basically I think that the original scheme on the part of law enforcement and the American spookocracy was that they really hoped that this particular legacy would be so technically obscure that nobody would bother. I mean, it's maths, isn't it? You know, I mean, encryption, it's maths. You have to know what a prime number is in order to understand this, and they really did not want this subject to public debate. In fact, every time the words National Security Agency are breathed aloud in American public discourse, the NSA suffers. So we now have this struggle with the EFF and CPSR and their allies attempting to publicize the fact that this is going on, while the FBI and the NSA are doing their best to get it all done immediately so they can simply present everyone with a fait accompli. What this means to Britons, I don't know. I do know that your spookocracy is, if anything, 5 times more powerful and scarier than ours. I mean, ours has a heck of a lot more money and probably better equipment. I can't guess other than saying I have read Spycatcher and my copy is underlined. You know, if you're interested in this, you have internet access, I would definitely recommend you start reading stuff off the EFF machine, EFF.org, and so forth. There will be trouble over this. I mean, there are people around who are very upset about this, who have millions of dollars, and I think law enforcement will eventually be a public debate. And I think that's a healthy thing, but it's also a very peculiar thing, because even among the people who are opponents of this idea, they don't seem to be seriously considering the true social implications of giving people privately held encryption that nobody but God can read. I mean, there's never really been anything like that in human society before. If you hid something in a safe, eventually someone would show up with an oxyacetylene torch or whatever. In this situation, you could say, take a very valuable virtuality, encrypt it with privately held encryption. If you drop dead of a heart attack, there's no way the entire human race working for millions of years can retrieve that thing. And the law enforcement people also argue very strongly that privately held encryption will in fact facilitate acts of conspiracy. And they bring up the whole usual melange of criminal scarecrows, the World Trade Center truck bomber types, various fringe terrorists, child pornographers of all kinds. In fact, the primary threat to British electronic civil liberties at the moment is pornography. No digital sex, please. We're British. Some of your law enforcement people here and MPs and so forth of the peculiar Tory orange strangling in women tights persuasion are very upset at the notion of people seeing dirty pictures on a computer screen and are extremely anxious that all bulletin board systems, whether privately or publicly held, be licensed, and that the people using them have to pass some kind of, you know, okayness test, I mean, whatever, some kind of government-led litmus to make sure that nothing untoward is going on and over their modems. In the United States, I think this licensing scheme would be fought bitterly and with enormous, you know, consequences, and it would be fought and has been fought basically on industrial grounds. It's like, don't license us, we're not going to pay this, this is a new industry, don't step on it. Here in Britain, I don't know. I know that there are people who are anxious about this scheme, but you know, I suspect people may in fact go humbly along with the wishes of the authorities that this stuff be kept nice and clean and tidy. You know, let's keep Britain digitally tidy. Well, and I want to change tack entirely because I am a science fiction writer and I hate talking about politics. And if it were not for the fact that the Secret Service did in fact come into my hometown and arrest, well, not arrest some people, they merely took every electronic item they possessed, who were involved with cyberpunk and writing cyberpunk science fiction books, I would not be doing this. I'm forced to, frankly, and I hope it's of some use to you. By the way, I did give away my book, Hacker Crackdown, on the internet this January. I wrote a new introduction and afterward, which is not available in the print edition. And it's now all over. I'm always getting e-fan mail here from 6.compulink.uk and demon.ac.uk. If those names and that internet jargon means nothing to you, I suggest that within 8 months it will be as familiar to you as the term virtual reality. And I would imagine that 90% of the people in this room will have internet accounts within 18 months, if you don't already. But, ladies and gentlemen, given this peculiar opportunity, I wanted to take the untoward liberty of actually directly addressing the topic of the conference. I better get some water first. I'm sorry for that high-speed rant, ladies and gentlemen. We are pressed for time. These are very complicated issues. And less complicated than some people would like them to be. I mean, I want to talk about the role of the body in the virtual world, and I want to begin by pointing out that the virtualities we already have actually scarcely do address the human body at all. If you saw some of the virtual demos earlier, it's like a pair of shades and a glove. Well, that's it. That's what goes into virtuality. A thing on your face and a glove. What we do is address the body's senses, usually just sight and hearing, and in a very limited way, tactility. We have some gloves that, you know, some have like thermal resistance metal strips in them that give them a kind of springiness, but the tactility is very, very limited. And as far as touch goes, it's only touch in the hands. So you can project a certain line of development with the impingement of virtuality on the body. You start with projection first, an image against a screen, then glasses, or perhaps some kind of lorgnette. I rather expect those to come back someday. And the head-mounted display, which actually straps on there. I worry about those a lot. I mean, if I were, for instance, watching a herpes virus commercial over a head-mounted display, I would wonder real carefully whether the thing had been wiped down since the last guy had been wearing it. We then move on to the virtual contact lens, which was not currently technically possible. I see no reason why it couldn't be eventually with sufficient miniaturization. The artificial cornea, actually go right in with some kind of programmable cornea inside the eye, and the entire artificial eyeball, probably with much enhanced capacities. And finally, direct contact with the optic nerves and brain vision sensors. But I would point out that once you get to the point of messing seriously with neurons, the collateral effects from this line of technological development will have shattered your society beyond recognition. It's always a good idea to keep those collateral effects in mind. I mean, I would point out, for instance, if we even understood what a skin cell was, and a skin cell is a much less complex thing than a neuron, 18 months later, everyone would have rhino hide. So now I want to get into the topic of a more fully immersive VR. I mean, the things we call immersive VR really are not very immersive. I mean, there are things that strap onto you. They don't immerse you. They're more of a bondage vibe there, frankly. If you actually see people doing, say, Sensate VR with the, the Gullickson rig and the Power Glove, it's a pitiable sight in many ways. I mean, they're sort of there and they're going. I mean, they're trapped in a room. They're an abandoned husk of a body with their senses extracted, and they're hallucinating. I mean, they're basically thinking like, "Oh, I can't find the blue sun. Where's the checkered room? Am I under the? And you could easily kill them with a stick." So I'd like to talk about rather more immersion. I mean, I've been playing with some of these ideas recently. These are fully science fictional ideas. I mean, don't invest in this, please. Unstable fluids. There's such a thing as CAD/CAM manufacturing recently. I don't know if you've followed this. I've been doing a lot of it in Japan. You have this tank of stuff. It's sort of like a gooey fluorocarbon, and it's a sort of an unstable molecular structure. And what you do is it's like a 3D printout machine, sort of like a 3D manufacturing display. The lasers cross, they sort of fuse the molecules in this tub of plastic, heat them up, they set, and it just sort of scans it from top to bottom, and you end up pulling out this great drippy thing, and you wipe the goo off of it, and you actually have a three-dimensional casting of a volumetric thing like the artificial duck there. You want a rubber duck, you just sort of press print and this 3D rubber duck comes right out. Well, what if you were in there, right? What if you're in there with the gloves and the goggles and an aqua lung? Now you can reach out and actually begin touching things. And you can actually create a physical environment, perhaps melt it back as you're going through it. A more reactive fluid, something a lot more quick, a lot quicker. You wouldn't know you're in a tub of glue. I mean, you'd be suspended there, a bit like a fly in amber. I think if it were blood heat, it'd be kind of an interesting, be like a sensory deprivation experiment. It would probably intensify at no end. So then you're floating through this thing, brushing against virtual objects which are immediately cast and then dissolved at will. And I think if you were to set up a thing like this, you'd probably use a fluidic computer for aesthetic reasons. I don't know if you know what fluidic computers are, but you don't have to use electricity on a chip. It's just very quick. You can, in fact, make computers which have tiny microscopic channels for fluid that travel through it and little gates that offer, they're the logic gates. They open and shut just on and off. The same structure as a regular electronic chip. It's just all done pneumatically or fluidically. So let's now take another version of this. Instead of the casting device, the casting goo, let's use artificial breathable fluids, a silicone embedded with oxygen, right? Now these exist. Hamsters can live in them for months at a time. I believe the film The Deep, some film has an example of this recently. What's that? The Abyss. Yes, The Abyss. As I say, where people are pumping up on this stuff. They're filling their lungs with this sort of oxygenated, very dense fluid. Now you can actually go in there and breathe. You can stay under there for days. And not only that, but since it's a fluidic computer at the bottom of the swimming pool, you're actually breathing the very stuff of computation. And I think the sort of people who would want to set up an environment like this would probably want to do that just for aesthetic and poetic reasons. So you open this pool of this stuff, people hyperventilate, jump in, fill their lungs with this stuff, and then you pour in a pint of liquid cannabis. And what a party. Now we're moving a little farther into this. I mean, it might get you to have a kind of layered creme de menthe thing. I mean, there's the breathable part down here and then the plastic part up here. And you're spending a lot of time there. But you have to come out eventually because, well, there are no bathrooms in cyberspace. you have to eat and so forth, and eventually you have to leave the environment, and it's a drag, because if you're a real addict, you don't want to go. So we move another step further. We're getting really into it now, and we go into a charming little divertisement I like to call blood bathing. Now, you just replace the substance with an artificial blood. Now, in order to get in this and really get into it, you have to lose most of your skin. But it doesn't really matter, because I envision this taking place probably in some kind of orbital environment where you never have to surface. Now, you lose the skin, you open the veins, you begin pumping this artificial blood through your body, and in fact, you're sharing a bloodstream with everyone else who's in the same virtual environment with you. Now, the object doing the virtuality for you is, in fact, a human brain. Well, it's not a human brain, but it's probably something like the human visual cortex, but cloned and spread out, I don't know, like the bottom of a tennis court, something like that. So you're actually in the same bloodstream as a giant computational human brain, and you're just sort of bringing the thing through your very corpuscles. And your brain is being oxygenated and filled with the same hormones and the same emotional chemistry as this other brain. So you're now into a kind of intimate, almost telepathic virtual environment. Now, I would call this a couple of centuries away, and I would suspect that it would have to be done by people who were rather eccentric. But I could see it being done, especially for people who were perhaps extremely aged, like 400 or 500 years old, and unable to persist any longer in a normal environment. Someone who was bedridden, quadriplegic, suffering extreme genetic degeneration, you could just sort of toss them into this blood bathing pool and let them melt. Because it would be a sterile environment. I imagine it'd be full of the usual leukocytes and you know, the whole, I mean, blood's a very interesting organ. It does a lot of things, white blood cells and so forth. You could die in it, and I think if you died there, you'd sort of be gently disassembled without ever feeling it. And probably without losing a lot. I mean, perhaps not even losing consciousness. If you were lucky, you might just sort of settle like a dead leaf to the bottom of the pool and have the layers of your brain slowly spread and melt into the support system, as it were, a kind of gentle virtual nirvana. Anyway, we're now approaching something. What we're approaching there is Ivan Sutherland's vision from the 1960s, which only goes to show that they did it all back then. It was something in the water. The ultimate display, which Benjamin was quoting earlier, a wonderful quote about the room in which the computer can control the existence of matter. If there's a difference between the technological attitude of the 1960s and that of the 1990s, I think it's that we not only understand what he could have said then, but we also recognize that there is no boundary between the matter controlled by the computer and the matter of the observer. The observer's body is a material entity. I guarantee you, once you step inside that room, you are utterly under the control of this device, whatever it may be. You may be the device for all of that, but if a bullet fired there can kill you, if you can sit in a chair and so forth, what Sutherland failed to emphasize is that the human body of the viewer, being material, would also be in the control of the computer, and therefore your chances of emerging from an experience in this room with a pair of great scaly duck's feet instead of the feet you'd gone in with would be extremely high. And the question is, would you care, or would it make a difference? And I would suggest that under the circumstances, it would make no difference at all. You'd be quite happy to have it happen. That's all I have to say to you. Thanks very much.
We're going to turn to Joan Truckenbrod now, who's going to, she's, I mean, in a sense, a true pioneer in this field. She's an artist who works at the Art Institute in Chicago. And she was actually working, she says she bought an Apple, something like 1968 or something like that, and was working on IBM mainframes in 1967. I mean, producing a drawing out of an IBM mainframe in 1967 is a big achievement. So she's going to tell us about some of the implications, the artistic implications of all this. Thanks very much.
I'm afraid I'm going to bring us back above ground at this point, or out of the the space that Bruce built here. It's not very often that I get to have a warm-up speaker like Bruce Sterling, so this is actually a delight. Could we start the slides, Dave? Currently, I think there's a struggle in the electronic arts to create a basis for aesthetic theory and criticism because there's such a variety of different forms that are emerging. Let's see if we, whoops. Okay. This is virtual reality here. Is the other tray, could someone start the other tray? Now, I thought it was interesting to start here about a quarter of a century ago, right here at the ICA, was the first exhibition of electronic arts called Cybernetic Serendipity, which maybe many of you are familiar with, but I thought I would go through some of the work so that you could get an idea of what was happening then and possibly think about how far we have come today. And the slide on your left is at the very beginning of the book, and I think there's some moral issues that, of course, will arise or emerge through the work here that we're talking about today. Oh, gosh. Okay. In that show, can we make sure they're focused, please? There was a variety of work. These are two composers. On the left is Herbert Brun, who these are scores that he did, and on the right you probably recognize scores by John Cage. There was also some choreography, some computer-assisted dance in that exhibition. These are sensitive devices that have a variety of different kinds of sensors in them. On the right there's this construction with feathers on the side that would move in response to acoustical ambience or sound ambience in the room. On the left, there were also sensors that would cause this device, this kinetic device, to move. These are various kinds of kinetic sculptures. On the right, you probably recognize Jean Tinguely's drawing machine. And again, remember, it's 1968. On the left are light kinetic pieces by Frank Malina. They were also sensitive to sounds and acoustical kinds of things in the environment. On the right is Nam-June Paik. And you can't see it very well, but in the lower left of that slide is a television image that's been processed or transformed of McLuhan, sort of a precursor of Photoshop filters today. And again, we're in 68. Two more kinetic pieces on the left. This one is responsive to light in the environment, and it would move one way or another depending on the light patterns in the environment. Also in that exhibition were computer-generated text and poems. Some examples here. On your right, those are examples of the computer's first Christmas card. So the curator, Ms. Reichart, attempted to span this enormous variety of modes of artistic expression. These are from films. On the right is John Whitney's Permutations, and on the left are some frames from a film by Ron Resch. In the bottom here, he's dealing with patterns from Fuller's geodesic domes. And these are drawings, plotter drawings, and yes, I think it was 1970 I had a show of plotter drawings that were done on an IBM mainframe. I believe it was a 360. These are some examples of those kinds of drawings. This is a drawing machine, and then the ones on the right were done by a group from Japan, very American subjects. And on the left is George Nees and some drawings that he did with stochastic processes, which are also being explored still today. And on the right are some drawings from a CalComp plotter. But the question here is that they've not one genre or form of artistic expression have emerged, but a variety of these. And so how do we deal with looking at that milieu? Also, in 1971, there was another exhibition in art and technology at the LA Museum of Modern Art. And the person writing there, Jane Livingston, delineated three categories. The first, she said, was rooted in traditional sculpture, and those people used heavy industrial materials and fabrication methods. The second category sought to exploit advanced technologies such as lasers, optics, and glass or gas plasma. And then her last category, which I think is the most interesting and pertinent to this issue of virtual reality in cyberspace today, is the artwork that investigated the psychological or experiential mode of activity in which participation should be made to stimulate a sense of self-awareness. And that was considered to be the focus of the work. For me, there are basically, I think, two different dimensions that we need to look at and look at in terms of their history and their sort of precursors of artistic expression. First is this area of interactive sculpture, interactive installation work, which has a physicality to the work, actually, that we're dealing with something physical and interacting in a physical environment. And clearly the antecedents of this work can be found in kinetics and experimental architecture. The other aspect that I see in the electronic area is a very broad arena encompassing art forms that are ephemeral, because they remain in this sort of floating state or suspended electronic state until the artist gives them form. For me, it's always the artist and their vision that's giving these things form. Their electronic signals or whatever, their memory, until they are radiated through a display screen or over a network through telecommunications or whatever, or projected through a video projector or through a VR headset. And they engulf visual, oral, tactile, gestural senses working in time and in space. So if we look at some of the early experiments, I guess you would say, I think we'll find that all of these electronic art forms embody the concepts of memory, experience, and anticipation, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The most central aspect of the electronic arts, I think, is the computer imaging arena, because it projects into artwork that relates to traditional artwork. It projects into animation, VR, telecommunication, and across that milieu. And one of the interesting things to look backwards a bit is to listen to some of the artists from the past. Moholy-Nagy talked about painting with light. And what he tried to do is deal with this issue of light on a canvas and how to bring the image off of a canvas into the environment with projected light. So he made these light constructions that were usually spatial, and that using projected light with them, there'd be a sense of reflection and shadow. He said, I painted as if colored light was projected onto the screen and other colored light superimposed over on top. So I wanted to show a couple of those as a background to this idea of electronic imaging and painting with light. And by the way, another person that really relates to this issue of painting with light, although we're going back further, would be the pointillist paintings of Seurat. And McLuhan talked about Seurat as being sort of the precursor of the television image. And Seurat being interested in the visual vibration created by placing tiny dots of complementary colors next to one another, and his feeling that he could create a richer color perceptually by dealing with light directly rather than dealing with pigments on a canvas. And that's exactly what we're doing when we're doing image making, is we're dealing with some of these the actual light phenomena here. Now, another precursor in terms of virtual reality, telecommunications, and interactive installation are areas such as experimental architecture and sculpture. Now, again in 1970, in an article titled The Aesthetics of Intelligent Systems, written by Jack Burnham, he discussed art as a conceptual focus in which the notion of form becomes process and system. transcending the literal notion of geometrically defined, transcending the notion of geometrically defined forms. And if we look at VR and what we've seen so far, we're talking again about geometrically defined forms. So I don't think we've gotten there yet. But he talks about a new type of aesthetic relationship that will emerge when one organism affects the behavior or the state of another. Intelligent systems could be considered a dialogue where two systems gather and exchange information so as to constantly change the state of the other. Now, I'm thinking about the virtual reality construct and the participant and that relationship, and how does one organism affect the behavior of the other, and how do we set up a dialogue between two systems in which both are gathering and exchanging information so as to constantly change the states of one another. Now, these are examples from a book called Arthropods. Some of you may be familiar with it, by Jim Burns, again in 1970. And here's the headgear, 1970, experimental architecture. They're concerned with meaning and essence that comes from the interaction of the environment and the person involved. They're talking about the ability of the environment to change in response to the habitat, the inhabitant, the person in the environment. And they wanted to empower people as activators of their own environment. Now, also as experimental architecture, they created these hypothetical synthetic environments. Looks familiar. If you look at Jenny Holzer's VR piece she has two that were at the Guggenheim, World 1 and World 2. Now I have to say I didn't see the piece, I've just read about it, but the imagery are constructed, simulated, artificial environments like these. And my question to people doing VR environments is, why can't we intuit these environments? Why do we have to construct these environments? Why are they geometrically defined and designed rather than intuited? These are some more of the environments that were supposed to be self-supporting, where the participant had control over the environment and it was responsive to their needs. Now, look familiar. Again, we're in 1970, and these are, this one on your left is called Flyhead, for an individual to put on and have a complete alteration of their environment, get away from daily dreary pressures and so on and so forth. And then the one on the right, which is larger, is called a mind expander. So I think this is a timely and interesting paradigm that we maybe haven't looked at and we have ignored a bit. I wanted to show a bit of my own work as well, which is quite different than anything you've seen. This is how I construct bodies in cyberspace. These are from '91, and I did a series dealing with sort of the social architecture and women's issues, the lack of support for socially, politically, economically for women, and their kinds of objectives and goals in raising children and raising families. I've also did a series on the assaulting nature of technology. When I go to the bank on Monday morning and I can't get my balance because the computer is down, for me that's outrageous, unacceptable. You know, and I find that the telephone bill is wrong, and I'm told that the computer says it's that way, so it has to be that way. No. So for me, there's an ongoing assault of sort of uncontained technology, and that's what those pieces were about. Then this series is about communication patterns that differ between particularly men and women. Women seem to have a much more organic way that they communicate ideas and thoughts, and the more algebraic ways represent a more male orientation. And so there'll be different kinds of what I call sociotexture, social architecture, that contrast these different ways of behaving and thinking. And talking. Now also in the backgrounds and the colors and the patterns and the textures that I used, I make the stuff, I don't simulate the stuff. Just because I'm in a computer environment doesn't mean that I have to simulate or visualize leaves. In the early images, I'm working with real leaves. They're on the computer, they're in there. I'm not telling the computer how to define a leaf and then make a leaf look like a leaf. So I think we've neglected that whole arena of real experiences that can be translated and communicated to the computer. These are flow patterns, but they're not simulated. They're not programmatically created. They're on the computer and then they get transferred right in. And these are more recent. For me, they're kind of mist people that are undulating in this organic and fluid space that comes about through the flow patterns that I use. And I'll just go quickly through those so I don't take too much time. I wanted to bring up one other example before we go on. In thinking about virtual reality and this issue of cyberspace, another antecedent or precursor I think we should think about is contemporary theater and people like John Cage. Classically, the model of theater has been one where there's an interpretation that the audience is all seeing the same kind of thing and all making the same kind of interpretation or receiving of an experience. But in contemporary theater, there's a relativity to the experience. And that's the kind of thing that John Cage plays off. Cage is interested in revealing those parts of reality that have been hidden, ignored, or degraded. Cage asserts that the world is a complex interrelationship of discontinuous events in time and space, of which a linear analysis is inadequate. Why, if we have a headgear and a glove on, can we only move through space? If space-time is a continuum, we should, with a gesture or a verbal command, be able to explore time as well. Why are we looking at virtual reality and limiting its dimensions? We should be working in space and time as well. Cage asserts also that perception is not sequential like language. Rather, it's like an electronic analogy in which everything happens at once. Now, I think there are clearly some problems here in moving into this issue of cyberspace and VR, and it's pretty clear that I'm here with the boys in the morning. The computer culture, the computer subculture, I guess we should say, is a social construct. And it's been developed and constructed by the people who make the hardware and the software. And right now, those are predominantly men. Consequently, the language, abort programs, execute programs, program crashes, those are all confrontational, kind of aggressive kinds of languages that really are not comfortable for women, that in a sense can exclude or distance women from working in those environments. So in addition to the language, there are processes and strategies that are also foreign to women. Not foreign, but not the way we perceive and sort of deal with the world. Sherry Turkle and Seymour Papert at MIT have done research to look at the way men and women use computers. And they found distinct differences. The research was done, I should tell you, in a class that taught programming. And programming has been structured on a sort of hierarchical, linear mode of thinking. But when they watched women make programs, they found that women explore the components of the program, moving around as though they were physical elements, such as words in a poem, notes in a musical composition, or the shapes and forms of a visual composition. So women worked in a much more relational way, so that the traditional mode of programming and the way we teach programming correlates with a more male orientation. And again, we have this problem of how women relate to and fit in and work creatively in that environment. And then we have, so beyond language and beyond the processing and the structures and the strategies, we have the objectives and goals. And I think, I don't even need to say anything about this, because if we look at the applications of computing, we find them to be very militaristic. We find them to be game-oriented. In Chicago, there's automated battlefields in virtual reality that I'm not at all interested in. So that there is a milieu here that needs to be confronted. It's sort of like Virginia Woolf when she talked about killing the angel in the house when she was trying to be a writer and going against the flow in terms of how women ought to behave in that time. In the arena of computing, women have to kill the angel in the house in order to work creatively. It's very important to be cognizant of that kind of arena. And I think in the electronic arts that there are also some philosophies that have arisen relating to the gender differences. I currently teach in a department where there's one more female, but there are 3 men and then myself. And they're terrific people, and we all have a very interesting working relationship that's been very positive and very productive. However, when they go to lunch, what do they talk about? The wires, the computers, the integrated circuit chips. We can get a chip to do this. We can get a chip to do that. And I'm interested in what kind of experience are we making. Okay, so that's I think one difficulty currently in the electronic arts. The other area is that there seems to be an attempt to diminish the importance and the contribution and the validity of visual images. Paul Brown, let's see if I can find you the quote here. Paul Brown, this was in the 1992 proceedings from SIGGRAPH Computer Art Show, which Ben mentioned earlier. Paul Brown states in his article, "We often find that artists now use computer systems to produce artifacts that are put in frames and hung on walls, an absurdity that almost defies comprehension." No, I don't think it does. And then in 1993, the art show was totally dedicated to interactive installations. Well, that's fine if the next year can be totally devoted to image making, but that's not the case. So, and the catalog stated that it featured only interactive art going beyond static 2D images. Okay, so it was a male that curated, Simon Penny curated that show as well. It's really curious because in the early days of electronic imagery, there were a lot of women participating. Miss Reichart, who did the show here in London, Ruth Levitt wrote a book in 1978, Lillian Schwartz, who's now published a book, Darcy Garbarg, Barbara Nessum, Copper Gillith, myself, we were all showing work early in the 70s, late in the 60s. And I've also published a book called Creative Computer Imaging. So it is curious that there are a number of women participating, and yet these attitudes seem to be pervasive. On the other hand, let's see if we can't look at other paradigms or other models that we might structure VR and the idea of cyberspace on. The telephone is really a female kind of environment. Well, if you think about the technology and the computer in the box and how you relate to that, and then you think about how we use the telephone, we go to the wall, push some buttons, and say hello. It's a very different kind of interaction. And early on, it was women that used telephones and women that were the operators in telephones. And the telegraph men who seemed to design the telephone system were very upset and disgruntled that the technology was continually being used by women. But it does have a fluidity, and for me, it suggests that maybe VR should be considered more like wraparound telephoning. Okay, wraparound telephoning. I can do this. I can talk to somebody. It should have verbal, visual, gesturing, all of those kinds of facilities. Easy, fluid, somewhat organic. In terms of, along those lines, in terms of this intuiting an environment as opposed to constructing an environment, there is a wonderful little book about a little child called Harold and the Purple Crayon. I don't have any slides of this, but Harold, it could have been Jennifer, let's say Jennifer, took a purple crayon and wanted to go for a walk one day. They drew a path. They got hungry. They drew an apple tree and had some apples. They didn't want anybody else to take the apples, although that sounds male. So they drew a dragon or a scary-looking animal, and as they finished drawing it, they became scared, and they were moving backwards, and the crayon made a curvy line and turned into water, and they fell in the water, but they quickly were able to retrieve themselves by drawing a boat. So these kinds of intuitive kinds of experiences, I think, should be available to the participants of VR, as well as the tools should be available to people constructing the VR environments. Now, I just want to summarize. I picked out 4 or 5 issues here. First of all, I worry that technology acts like a template. We get seduced by the technology and we make work that uses the artifacts of the technology, like point and click. What does point and click have to do with artwork? If the artwork is about the technology, maybe it does. But I think all aspects of artwork should reflect the vision of the artist, not the artifacts of the technology. So the first thing to be aware of, or to be concerned about, is looking at the artifacts of technology, and are you using them because they're there, or are you using them because they're important and an integral part of your work? And secondly, this idea of envisioning VR as wraparound telephoning with visual and verbal as well as gestural modes of navigation and negotiation. And thirdly, this issue, if experience lies in a space-time continuum, the participant should be able to navigate in time as well as in space. The fourth issue of VR, for the participant being an intuitive experience, and there should be tools available for people constructing VR sets so that those can be constructed intuitively. And I think the fifth question here, when I think about intuitive tools and intuitive experiences, it calls into question the issue of interface. I think interface design is old. It's a past concept. We've looked at how I interface with this keyboard in this machine. That's too narrow-minded. Relationships with technology is on a continuum. It's like threads woven into a piece of yarn. And so we have to look at the relationships and the continuity, not the interface, but the relationships, and this sort of thread of continuity has to be brought across as an alternative to the virtual reality interface. Thank you.